This is Camp Countdown, a Toronto Maple Leafs podcast series. I'm your host, Kyle Cushman, and on today's show, we're diving into the game of 2023 draft pick Noah Chadwick. Taken 185th overall in the 6th round, Chadwick has been one of the stories in the Leafs organization the past year. He's gone from a late round kind of swing on a project big defenseman to a guy legitimately pushing to play for Team Canada at the World Juniors and a legitimate top 10 prospect, potentially even top 8 prospect in the organization. You look at certain resources like elite prospects, they have them all the way up in the top 5 of the Maple Leafs organization. So let's dive into Chadwick's game. As I mentioned, taken in the 6th round last year, he was signed to an entry-level contract in December of last year as well, so his entry-level contract will slide twice. That's why they signed him before the turnover of the year, so that his contract would slide twice. Just a little note, but that's why some of those depth contracts get signed at the end of the calendar year, late in December like that. For Chadwick, it's a pretty big deal to be signed as a 6th round pick in the year that you were drafted. There are not a lot of 6th and 7th round picks that get entry-level contracts that quickly. But Chadwick deserved it, putting up 12 goals, 56 points in 66 games over the course of the entire season. That put him top 15 among all WHL defensemen in points per game, and that's a huge jump from the 5 goals and 20 points he scored as a WHL rookie in his draft year. So going back to when he was drafted and looking at a 6'4" defenseman who puts up 20 points in 60-something games in his draft year, it's easy to see that pick and immediately think back to the Mark Hunter drafts, where the Leafs took a bunch of swings on tall defensemen with limited offensive potential who never really panned out. Funny enough, Nick Matanen, one of those defensemen, is back in the organization after flourishing in Europe the last couple of seasons, specifically with the offensive game. So we'll see how that one pans out. But none of the other big swings on big defensemen have really panned out. Emily Rasanen has played low level in Europe. Keaton Middleton is probably the most successful of which, becoming a regular in the Colorado Avalanche organization. Fedor Gordiev barely played in the AHL, has been an ECHLer, and I think went back to Russia actually. And so when Chadwick gets drafted, it's easy to think immediately that he's one of those types of players. And I'll be honest, when he was first drafted, I didn't know much about the player. That's where my mind first went. But then I saw that he was ranked by Elite Prospects, 132nd by them in their draft ranking. And Elite Prospects is a great resource. EP Rinkside is one of my favorite subscriptions that I have. I read a lot of what they put out, and specifically their prospect coverage is second to none across the hockey sphere. And their rankings are based a lot on, of course, the eye test and watching players, but also a lot of data backs up their rankings, and the tracking data that people like Mitch Brown do, specifically talking about the WHL, which is the league that Chadwick comes out of. That's something that really holds a lot of weight for me. I really respect Mitch as a scout, as an analyst. And so somebody like Chadwick, being held in high regard for him to make it on Elite Prospects rankings and be somebody that was on basically his watch list, for lack of a better term, that gave me a lot of intrigue to Chadwick as a player. And at the time when he was drafted, or after he was drafted, I should say, Mitch wrote that Chadwick is a smart offensive player despite the lack of point totals that he had in his draft year. He's always scanning, always looking for that teammate in the slot, and that it was a nice swing on upside for the 6'4" defenseman out of Lethbridge. And sure enough, that's exactly what we saw this past year. The offensive game popped in a bigger role with Lethbridge stepping up into that kind of top pairing role after being a kind of 4, 5, 6 defenseman in his first year in the WHL, stepped up to the top of his lineup, was a second team all-star in his division, top 15 among WHL defensemen in points per game. And actually among 2023 draft picks, only 3 defensemen out of the WHL scored at a higher rate than Chadwick last season. And they were all drafted significantly higher than Chadwick. You look at Luca Quignoni, a smaller defenseman, drafted 123rd. Tanner Molendyk, an average-sized defenseman, drafted in the first round. And Caden Price, a 6'1" defender, drafted in the 3rd round. Compare that to the 6'4" defender in Chadwick taken in the 6th round. And that's very, very good company to have just 1 year after his draft. Intelligence is a lot of what comes down to the strengths of Chadwick's game. He's a very smart offensive player, and that leads to being smart defensively as well. And the physical tools really round that into a very intriguing profile. And it's not just on the ice that Chadwick is a very smart player. He's very smart off the ice as well. In fact, he was the WHL and the CHL Scholastic Player of the Year. And when he was accepting that award at the CHL Awards at the end of the season, Chadwick mentioned that after his playing days are over, he wants to become a general manager one day. So somebody that is a very bright young kid. He's still just 19 years old, knows what he wants to do long term, has the aspirations of having a long career, but also knows what he wants to do after the career in staying in hockey as well. So definitely somebody worth keeping an eye on as a very, very intelligent person and a very smart player on the ice as well. The intriguing profile that Chadwick presented in his draft year flourished this past season. His tracking data took big jumps over the course of the year. In fact, Mitch Brown had him as the biggest leap of all players improved in the CHL last year, becoming, in his words, a top 10 CHL defenseman. Really good offensive numbers in terms of the play creation, passing, finding players in open space, that kind of stuff. Very good defensive numbers, defending the rush in zone defense with a 6'4" frame. And all of that blending together to be, as I mentioned, a very intriguing profile for a well-rounded defenseman that has popped offensively, really smart offensively, but also gives you that good defensive profile given that 6'4" frame. The limiter in Chadwick's game is the skating. It's gotten better for sure, but it's still the kind of key weakness in his game that can prevent him from really kind of unlocking that next level as kind of a puck carrier type rather than a passer as it is right now. And of course, that skating ability will put him into trickier situations as the level kind of increases once he eventually makes the AHL and then hopefully the NHL as well. The lack of foot speed and mobility is something that is definitely an area to work on over the coming years. And if that can get closer to NHL average, that is what can really unlock his potential as a top 4 defenseman. But right now, I kind of see him still in that kind of 3rd pairing projection where he has the tools to be a very good even strength defenseman, especially against kind of lesser bottom of the lineup opponents, with that kind of smart offensive game, smart defensive game, 6'4" size, can chip in a little bit on special teams if you need him to as well. That's kind of the projection that I still see from him right now, but we could see a little bit more him step up into a top 4 role, depending on what we could see from him this year with the Lethbridge Hurricanes. And then, of course, when he eventually makes his debut in the AHL full time. He has one more season with Lethbridge before jumping to the Marlies in 2025. And so this upcoming year is going to be big for Chadwick. We already saw that big jump going from kind of a depth defenseman in the WHL to a legitimate top of the lineup defenseman in the WHL. He'll be pushing for that Defenseman of the Year title with Lethbridge. There's going to be some big competition there in the WHL, but he's in that kind of short list among defensemen who could push for that award. The big question, though, for this upcoming season is less about the WHL and more about the World Juniors. He was at Team Canada's camp at the Summer Showcase this year. His general manager with Lethbridge, Peter Anholt, is the GM for Team Canada once again. That's going to be a big boost for potentially making that roster. So if Chadwick has a good start to the season again and continues to push higher, continues to push closer or even surpass that point per game mark, there's definitely a chance that he could play for Team Canada at the World Juniors this December. It would be really cool to see Chadwick get to play for Team Canada at the World Juniors as a 6th round pick, somebody that wasn't really on a lot of radars, even though he probably should have been as a 6'4" defenseman with kind of these offensive smarts. So we'll kind of see how this year goes. But he's already on an NHL contract. He's already pushed into the top 10 and kind of well into the top 10 as a Maple Leafs prospect in the system just 1 year after being drafted. His trajectory is on a very good path right now, and I'm very excited to see what he can do this year in the WHL and kind of push his stock even higher, and then in a year's time, pushing as a professional in his debut season with the Marlies. So without further ado, it's best to jump to my conversation with none other than Mitch Brown. Very excited to get to this conversation, diving more into Chadwick's game, kind of the details that make him such an intriguing prospect, and then the things that he has to work on to eventually become an NHL defenseman. Very excited to welcome on Mitch Brown to talk all about Noah Chadwick. Mitch, thanks for taking some time today to chat.
Yeah, as soon as you said Noah Chadwick, I had to come on.
Of course. And so, yeah, I think we should start right there where you've definitely been a fan of Chadwick's game for a little while now. He was ranked as in the mid 130s in Elite Prospects draft rankings when he was first draft eligible. And he was somebody that, based on your tracking data, was somebody that was intriguing. Can you kind of take us through when he first got on your radar there?
Yeah, so the first Lethbridge Hurricanes game I saw that year was in early October, and right away you could see the potential. Big guy, playmaker, smart, defended relatively effectively. And then throughout the season, it kind of became one of those things. Why isn't anyone talking about him? Why aren't people asking me about him? I bring him up in conversations with scouts and nothing. Just not someone who was really on the radar. And so I was a little bit concerned that he was going to go undrafted. And so we ranked him somewhere around 130, I think, which at one point I had him as a second round prospect. And so, yeah, big regret on that one, because this year it turns out he's at minimum a top 10 defenseman in the CHL, plays huge minutes, game flows through him. So it was a pretty interesting, when you're dealing with WHL rookies and CHL rookies in general, you're not always sure what to expect throughout the season. But with him, he was a player who, of course, with a little bit of hindsight attached to it, he was a player who was just always going to have a breakout as a bigger guy who played very smart. And the game is moving towards this sort of playmaking, activation, kill rushes early type style. And that's what he does.
Yeah, and so that's the fascinating part to me, because you mentioned everything about the profile. He has the size at like 6'4". He has the smarts. He has some of the offensive instincts. And yet he didn't go until like the 6th round in his draft and wasn't talked about really at all. Why do you think he flew under the radar so much in his draft year?
Well, he was used more as like the number 4 on Lethbridge in his draft year, so you're not getting a ton of minutes when you go out to see him. But also the skating was a big concern. I think he's alleviated some of those concerns, but he looks a lot stronger, a lot more stable. With defensemen with his size, right? It's going to take a little bit longer for them to develop not necessarily, they're going to have the skills, they're going to have the quickness, but they're not necessarily going to have the stability all the time. And so there's going to be some awkwardness that they're going to have to fight through. So it wasn't always pretty with him. He was effective, but again, it's not always pretty. And sometimes when you're projecting players, a lot of it is about their fluidity, their technical prowess, and so on. And so you're trying to figure out, okay, they can do all of these things. Can they develop the reads? With him, it was more of he's very smart. He has the reads. Can he develop the feet? Can he develop the stability? And I think so far he's trending in that direction.
Yeah, and so this year he has the big breakout season. You mentioned him as potentially a top 10 CHL defender across all of Canada, nearly point per game, 12 goals, really popped offensively to kind of back up some of those traits that you saw initially in his rookie season. What were some of the key areas that you saw him really take those big leaps in?
So the first area, again, just going back to the skating thing, I think that opened up a lot more of the game to him. We'll get to the weaknesses, I'm sure, at some point, but having more fluidity doesn't just mean that you're going to be able to jump in the play more. It means that when you see the Noah Chadwick highlights, you see him make that quick little spin move or those 3 crossovers to get into a shooting lane or whatever. And now he's able to do that quicker, more fluid with more fluidity. Man, I need to find a new word today. But the big thing is that it allows you, like, when you have that stable base, it allows you to instantly shoot. It allows you to instantly pass. And so he has that now. Plays are happening quicker. He's able to just look up and then move the puck immediately. And with him, a lot of it's in the details, right? It's not necessarily that he can make, the cross slot pass. With him, it's that he's going to take the puck in motion and move. When I look at the Toronto Maple Leafs in the playoffs, one of the struggles has been that when the puck goes to the D, it dies. Their D gets the puck, they catch it flat-footed, they can't make a play even if they have an open option. With Chadwick, that's never an issue because he has great habits. Every puck is in motion. He knows where he's going with the puck before he gets it. Head's always up. He's not really a big point shooter. He's going to be the guy who's going to build the play and then try to get a shot at the top of the slot. He's not really going to, say, take a one-timer. He's going to get the puck, walk into space, and then look for that teammate on the far side for the cross slot chance. And then the other part of the equation is what he was doing on breakouts. So with defensemen in the CHL, you generally see a lot more carriers than you do in the NHL. That is not Noah Chadwick's game at all. He's not going to carry the puck, so you don't really have the same translatability concerns as you do with other big top pair defensemen. He's a passer, and he's very accurate. He makes plays under pressure, and he's making high value plays. So he goes up the boards if he has to, don't get me wrong. But for the most part, what he's looking to do is get a puck under pressure, move it through the forecheck to an open teammate. That's usually across the ice or to the middle. And then he's going to jump into the play, become a quick return pass option. And then you get to see him cook in the offensive zone, which is where he's really, you know, he's the powerhouse of Lethbridge. He's the guy who gets the puck 100 plus times a game at even strength. Everything that they do on the offensive zone moves through him, and all that starts by his ability to get the puck out of his zone as a 6'4" guy, which you don't see ever really.
Yeah, and so doing your tracking data, which is such an incredible resource for looking at prospects because we're so limited in kind of what's available in the public space. He had that obviously huge jump, not just in his point totals, but also in the tracking data as well. What is kind of the area that stuck out most to you in tracking his data this season?
So as a general overview of how this works, I track a bunch of different metrics. It's not just like shots and passes, but where they're shooting from, what types of shots they're doing, the types of plays they're making in transition, the types of defensive zone breakups they're getting. And all these things are translatable or not translatable to some degree. And so I'll go through the ones that matter the most. So with him, there's no waste in the offensive zone. He doesn't turn the puck over. Generally, his expected goal, so the scoring chances that he's getting, is higher relative to the WHL than the shot. So that's a sign that he's generally being quite efficient. He's not taking a bunch of point shots and stuff. And then as a passer, that's really where he shines the most. He's, I think it was in the 97th or 95th percentile in basically every playmaking metric that I have amongst defensemen. Again, he's 6'4". That's usually something that you see for 5'11" guys. And then the transition stuff was all very high end as well. I think overall in transition, his impact was 99th percentile. So in English, that's about fourth in the entire CHL. Defense was very strong, rush defense. There are some flaws in his defensive game that we'll get to, but rush defense, D-zone breakups scored at a top pair to number one level. So you would generally consider that to be somewhere in the top 100 to top 60 range of CHL defensemen. But the number one thing that he does is creating time and space for his teammates. So this was where he was elite, kind of like one of three after Matejchuk and Zane Parekh, where
pretty good company.
Yes, you might have heard of them. So it's getting the puck. That's with his breakout passes, with his offensive zone playmaking, with his off puck movement to create space for their shots and so on. But it all comes down to when he gets the puck, it is going to be in a better position for his teammates. Everything that he does goes into improving the condition of the puck, so to speak. So that's the special element, and that's where the tracking data really highlights the uniqueness of his game. When you're projecting, you're looking for the unique things. What does this guy do differently? Everyone can play these days. Everyone has something that they can do at an NHL level, but can they do it at a special level? Do they have that next level ability? And his is creating time and space for his teammates. He makes everyone around him better.
Yeah, and so we've kind of looked so far mainly at like the intelligence and kind of leaning towards the offensive side of the game. How does his defensive game project at this stage, given the 6'4" frame? I know that's an area that a lot of people are excited about, just given the frame and what defensive potential that Chadwick has.
So he's definitely an above average defenseman in the CHL. He's a strong rush stopper. What he does extremely well is not so much in the one-on-one face-to-face. It's more of when he's catching opponents at the red line, stepping into them, pivoting, coming across, timing his poke checks. It's a very intelligence-based defensive game. It's not so much about power or speed. And so in the defensive zone, you see a similar ability to like kind of angle attacks, to close space early. But because he doesn't necessarily have that two-step quickness, if he's wrong on what's happening next, you see him get burnt quite a bit. So the big thing for him is improving his pivots and improving his defensive skating to the point where he can continue to be that anticipation-based defenseman, but also be able to stop more one-on-ones. To go back to the data, one of the interesting
Mhm.
things is that though he scores as a very high rush defender in terms of percentage, so he stops a ton of rushes relative to the amount of rushes he gives up, the ones that he gives up tend to be for, high danger chances against. He's someone who, if you're going to beat him, he doesn't have any corrective ability to be able to pivot and deflect the shot, be able to stick lift the guy or whatever. That's not something that he has in his game quite yet. So it's going to come down to a lot of like developing those more athletic based things. When you look at, say, Ben Danford, for example, Ben Danford can really pivot, stay with guys. He can keep them in front of him. With Chadwick, he's going to have to be more of an anticipatory guy in the NHL because he's not going to have that mobility as an advantage. So tightening up those reads, improving the mobility where he can. The margins will always be slim, so he might never be a true shutdown guy. But if he does that and adds a little bit more physicality, I think he'll be able to float.
Yeah, and so we talk about the skating, and that was the big knock on him in his draft year, the lowest graded aspect of his game. How have you seen that improve in the past year to be on a track to where it's less of a concern if he eventually makes it to the NHL level?
Definitely more, it's the stability, the fluidity thing that we talked about. That's the real thing. I don't think I'm sure he's probably quicker by extension. He's probably faster by extension, but it's really that there's more of a stable platform for him to let his mind do the work. So it's still a below average projection to the NHL. I think it's a heck of a lot closer than it was last year. This is going to be a very telling season to figure out where exactly he's at because now we know that he's the guy on his team. We know that he can play offensively. We know that he can run the power play. We know that he can play a gritty style of defense. It's going to be, can he do things earlier? How much more mobility is he going to have? Can he do things in a more, let's say, NHL way? So this season will be really telling to where he's at, but I don't want people to think that this is a potentially crippling flaw. He is the type of guy who won't need skating as an advantage to play in the NHL. He can play in the NHL with skating as below average, without a doubt.
Yeah, and so we look ahead to this upcoming season, and you mentioned he's already established himself as the guy on Lethbridge, especially among the defensive group. The big area that we saw this summer was he was named to Team Canada's training camp roster for the World Juniors, which is a big step for a defenseman drafted as late as he was when you look at all the first and second round picks that were on that roster. Do you think he has a legitimate chance at making the World Junior roster come December? It does help that his Lethbridge GM is also the GM of Team Canada there. But just given how we saw his game progress in the past year, do you think he has a chance of making that roster?
If he makes it, it'll be probably more of a specialist bottom pairing role. I think, and that's probably the perfect situation for him, right? Because when you look at how it's going to fit with the Toronto Maple Leafs in a few years' time, that's probably what he's going to be, or at the very least start as. And so the World Juniors isn't necessarily going to change any projections, but it can certainly give you an idea. What is this guy going to look like in the role that he's most likely to play in the NHL? And so I think when I look at it, Chadwick has enough diversity in his game. He's big, obviously, so that's going to be a factor. You mentioned the connection there. I think at this stage, he's probably a top 7 defenseman that'll be eligible for that team, so he should probably make it. If he does, though, probably more of PP2, or maybe they'll use him on the penalty kill in a bottom pairing role. And there, I think, with the way that he plays the game, how he makes decisions on the ice, the speed that he makes decisions at, you're probably going to see him play a little bit more of a streamlined game, a little bit more simple, but he's also still going to be seeking value on all of his puck touches. You're probably just going to see it look in a slightly different, more NHL translatable way.
Yeah, and so this upcoming season, that's obviously the big area that people are excited about him potentially making Team Canada. But what are your expectations for him come the WHL season, returning to Lethbridge, likely for that final season in the WHL here? He had the big leap in terms of the production last year. What are the steps that he could potentially take this upcoming year?
So I'd be very curious to see what the offense looks like. So we know that he can make plays from the top. We know that he can activate at the top of the slot for scoring chances. I'd be very curious to see if he becomes more of that high-end offensive creator. So someone who's going to make plays off the half wall, someone who's going to try to fake left and go right and cut inside. You see it in flashes last season for sure, but the mobility didn't always support it. So I wonder if we're going to see him try to take that step to be the high-end offensive creator, kind of similar to what Fraser Minton was able to accomplish in Saskatoon this year. And then I'm also very curious to see the defense. I have no doubt that his transition game it will continue to be high end. I am very curious to see he's going to be playing even more minutes. There's going to be even more pressure on him to perform and to be the shutdown guy. He's probably going to have to play a more physical style as well. So I'd be very curious to see if he's still able to be a highly efficient defender and if he's able to take that next step as a play killer.
Yep. And so now at this stage, he's taken that big jump from being that kind of long shot, sixth round prospect who has some intriguing tools, and you hope that he can kind of build on those. He's already built on a lot of those in the past year. What do you see as kind of his NHL projection in terms of his potential? Is it as that kind of third pairing, intelligent guy who can chip in on some special teams, or can he push higher in the lineup?
I think that's the most probable outcome for sure. I think there's also the chance, again, because of the uniqueness of the skill set, that he ends up as sort of this complementary middle pairing guy. So someone who's very good at moving the puck, transporting it, can provide some secondary offense. And then you pair him with someone who's probably also in the same type of mold. So someone who's also a puck transporter, but a little bit more physical, maybe a little bit more aggressive, someone who's maybe a little bit more mobile and good at skating back and picking up pucks, someone like a Ben Danford, right? So you have two guys who can make plays at the level that the forwards will need, but also complement each other's strengths and weaknesses to become sort of this middle pairing shut down type. In today's NHL, shutting down the opposition isn't just about being able to get the puck off people. It's even more about being able to bypass additional battles in the defensive zone, right? Like the thing with these guys is that when they get the puck, they don't just throw it up into another battle up the boards where the forward is less likely to win it. Because, the forward's going to have the D pinching in on them today because the D always steps up, and they're going to have the F3 stepping up into them as well. So, it's a 1-on-2. The forward's going to lose that battle the majority of the time. So you essentially negate your own defensive impact by doing that. Chadwick doesn't do that. Danford doesn't do that. And I think when you look at the Leafs, with all this emphasis on size these days in the true living area, that's the big question mark, right? How much these guys are going to be able to take the puck off people? Are they going to be able to get it out of their zone? So in that sense, Chadwick might actually have a pretty interesting pathway to the NHL. Like he might actually be able to provide something a little bit different if the blue line continues to go down this pathway in a few years. So for the Leafs, certainly he's someone who could push for a middle pairing role, no doubt.
Yeah, and so at this stage of his development, what would you consider the one standout trait of his game?
Definitely creating time and space for his teammates. That's the number one thing. You get him the puck ends up in a much better position than it was when he got it. Every single touch. That's his thing. He gets it 100 times a game, and 75% of those touches add significant value to the sequence. He's someone who doesn't waste time with the puck. He makes controlled, high-value plays, and then he can also streamline and simplify when necessary.
And on the converse side of that, what is the key area that you need to see him continue to develop in these coming years to reach that potential?
So of the things that we haven't mentioned so far, retrievals, puck retrieving skills for sure. Being able to pivot, skate back, get it. Chadwick can win the race and he can establish body positioning on players, but the size does make it a little bit harder for him to make an ensuing play off the retrieval. That's not to say that you want him to spin off the check and then throw a bomb 3 lines up the ice for a breakaway, right? It's more that you want to see him be able to absorb that pressure and then make a quick 3-foot pass to his D partner who's now wide open and can make that pass, right? So it's finding more opportunities where he can absorb that contact, make that play under pressure instead of eating the puck along the boards and creating a battle.
Awesome, Mitch. Thanks so much for taking the time today. Let everybody know where we can find your work.
You can find my work at eprinkside.com. There we have lots of articles. We have a prospect pool ranking series going on right now. The Toronto Maple Leafs will be featured pretty soon, and Noah Chadwick will land very, very high on the Toronto Maple Leafs prospect pool ranking, which honestly, the Leafs prospect pool right now is very exciting. There's a lot of interesting talent that has taken pretty significant steps this season. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can follow me at Mitch L. Brown.
Yeah, I can't recommend the EP Rinkside stuff enough. If you're even somewhat interested in prospect coverage, especially, it is well worth it. It is some of the best prospect content out there. And the Countdown series is one of the things that I look forward to most every single year. Mitch, thanks for taking the time today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
My pleasure.
That's going to do it for today's edition of Camp Countdown. Thanks again to Mitch for jumping on the show. Be sure to check out the EP Rinkside Prospect Rankings article that's going to be listed in the show notes, specifically the Leafs one. Must read for me every single year, the entire series, but specifically the Leafs article as well. I've been under the weather the past few days, so apologies for missing an episode on Friday and on Monday. I'm feeling close to 100%, not quite there just yet, but feeling good enough to get back into the recording mode and going to be pumping these out probably all the way straight through until the start of the season. Might miss a day or two depending on the schedule the rest of the way, and might have to double up some days, but the plan for the most part is basically an episode per day throughout the rest of the training camp preseason schedule right up until October 9th. So looking forward to that, and thanks again for tuning in. We'll have more Camp Countdown tomorrow. See you then.